Welcome everyone who's joining us for this first conversation in our Transformer State series on digital government and human rights. My name is Christian van Veen and I'm the director of the Digital Welfare State and Human Rights Project at the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice. Our series, and today is the first in that series, will aim to focus on specific case studies of digital government transformation around the world and its implications for human rights. And we'll have a specific emphasis on innovation in what is often referred to as the welfare state. For each conversation in this monthly series, my colleague Victoria Adelman and I will interview a human rights practitioner, an academic, or another expert on a specific case study of digital government for about an hour. That's the aim. We realize that an hour is short, so we might go over just a little bit today. Today we will discuss universal credit in the United Kingdom, and our next two conversations on October 28th and November 20th will look at case studies in Kenya and Australia respectively. And these conversations will be recorded and made available to a wider audience afterwards. And our aim with this series is to introduce a wider audience of human rights students, academics, and practitioners and other interested audiences to the implications of digital government for human rights. And each conversation will look at the promise and benefits of these innovations, what is driving the changes, what these innovations entail in detail, how it affects the power of governments and its interaction with citizens, and the risks and the benefits from the perspective of human rights law. Another goal that we have with this series is to stimulate the formation of what we call a community of practice of those interested in digital government and human rights. And through this series and participation in it, but also through regular blogs posted by students and young academics on our webpage, and through the sharing of relevant reports and other documents, as well as a regular newsletter, we hope to quite informally bring closer together a network of activists, academics, and other interested individuals committed to ensuring that digital government conforms to universal human rights standards. I'm very excited that we have Richard Pope here today as our guest in this series, with whom we will be discussing the case study of universal credit in the UK. I had never heard of universal credit before I visited the UK in November 2018 as part of the team of the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. And on that visit, we analyzed universal credit, both as a big welfare reform on the policy side, as well as a big digital reform of UK government. But before we begin, let me first introduce my colleague with whom I will be doing this series, Victoria Adelman. She's a research scholar working with me on the Digital Welfare State and Human Rights Project. And she has undertaken extensive research on universal credit. Before joining us here at NYU, Victoria has worked for Minority Rights Group International, the United Nations, the European Commission, and the Oak Foundation. And Victoria, I'm turning it over to you now.
Thanks very much. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And just as a quick reminder, we will have a Q&A at the end of the interview. So please do send in your questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And let us know who you are and who's asking the question. We're so thrilled to have Richard Pope with us. He's excellently placed to discuss these issues. Richard was part of the founding team at the UK Government Digital Service, which is a unit within government responsible for leading digital transformation across departments. He worked as product manager for the first version of gov.uk, which is the unified government website through which hundreds of government services can be accessed. And this won the Design of the Year award in 2013. He also co-authored the Digital by Default Service Standard, which all UK government digital services must meet. While within the government digital service, he worked with policy and delivery teams across departments to redesign government services, including working with the Department for Work and Pensions, which is the government department responsible for welfare in the UK. The government digital service was involved with the reset of the digitalization and design of universal credit, which we'll discuss later. And following this, Richard was commissioned by the Open Society Foundations to write a report about digital welfare, which audience members can access via the link that will be posted in the chat.
That's an impressive resume, and that makes you well placed, Richard. I think to start us off by briefly introducing what universal credit is. Our audience members, some of whom are quite knowledgeable, know about universal credit. Others might have a little bit less of an idea of what it entails exactly. So could you briefly explain it to us? How is it? How did it come about? How does it work? And also sort of briefly touch upon how universal credit is on the one hand a major policy reform of the British welfare state, and on the other hand is clearly a very ambitious project of digital reform of the UK government.
Sure, and thanks for having me here today and for the nice introduction. I will do my best. So universal credit's many things to many people. I guess at its simplest, it's worth saying that it is now the main working age benefit for the UK population. It's operated by the Department for Work and Pensions, part of the UK government, and it's a service that's provided online via a digital account, but also through a network of job centres and some elements of telephone support as well. I think the most important characteristic to understand about universal credit is that it's a dynamic benefit. That's probably the thing that sets it apart from other welfare systems. So it's dynamic in two ways. It's dynamic in terms of the monthly payment that people get, that goes up and down over time, and also in terms of the expectations that the state places on claimants of benefit. Those go up and down over time, and they go up and down on the basis of people's earnings. It uses what it refers to as a real-time feed of people's earnings from employers to calculate that, and quite a long list of data points about people's lives, about their circumstances. So that includes things about their children, their health situation, their housing, as well as their earnings and employment status. In policy terms, it's also kind of very opinionated in the expectations it has around family and financial circumstances. So the payments are made on a monthly basis, whereas some of the benefits it replaces are actually on a bi-weekly basis. Everything is a monthly basis. There's one payment per household, and you must claim this benefit as a couple, and there's quite a broad definition of what a couple is. And there's a particular view of what kind of what constitutes personal responsibility. So there's this kind of like there's policy aims like wrapped in with it as well. It's not just a digital system. And then finally, it's also a very large scale digital transformation. So it's replacing multiple existing benefits, all of which were to some extent digital, depending on the definition of digital. You know, there are legacy systems in place that are being replaced. So it's a sizable technology project as well. One that had a fairly difficult first couple of years. So you mentioned the reset of the project. That was a couple of years in when initially the Department of Work and Pensions had outsourced a lot of the work. There was then a reset, and GDS, Government Digital Service, worked with the department to build an in-house team to develop the service. So universal credit is also a bunch of people working in government buildings in the UK, designers, developers, technologists, who kind of build this thing day to day. So I think, to sum up, it's best to view universal credit as a kind of a socio-technical, political thing. It's not just about technology. It's a political project that tries to compel particular behaviour from the public, and it's a welfare reform, and it's a rethinking of the welfare system of the digital age. So there's lots kind of going on in that.
That's great. And as you mentioned, there's so much here. There's many different and potentially competing goals that are really tied into this project. So it's not just digitization. There are so many things going on. And for example, policy statements said they explicitly wanted to change behavior and cut costs and change the notion of responsibility, as you say. But we'd quite like to hone in on a specific, like one of these goals, which is user-friendliness. So basically making interaction with the welfare state easier for recipients. And we're focusing on this because we see it in many other countries that are embarking on digital transformation. There's really this selling point that it's going to be user-friendly. So this is not just a digital system, it's also online for the claims process. So I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about how this aim of user-friendliness that was proclaimed in some policy documents was translated into the design of universal credit by developers.
Okay, I mean, so just to slightly caveat my answer before I get it, I think if you look at some of the original policy announcements, they mentioned kind of ease of use and usability in passing, but actually the primary drivers were generally around efficiency, getting more people into work, saving money through automation, that kind of thing. But you're right, there are, as there are with many digital projects, kind of promises about ease of use kind of get put in there by at the beginning. That said, certainly the reset of universal credit happened at a particular moment in the history of government digital services in the UK, where there had been a repositioning of the way government approached the design of digital services. So whereas historically it would have essentially designed these things up front, sliced them up and given them out to external companies, it was beginning to do more of that work in-house, and it was beginning to build up user-centered design capability across government. So some of that happened within the government digital service, but it was actually happening within different departments as well. And that approach is very much about trying to place the needs of users first and design around an understanding of what things a user of a digital service needs to achieve rather than the things that government's trying to achieve. That approach comes with a bunch of practices around doing user research, testing ideas with people, iterating, improving designs over time. Now, there's a kind of interesting play there between kind of that emerging narrative around user-centered design in government and what was happening within universal credit, because there was mention in some of those early kind of early policy statements around digital, but actually they were more positioned around digital as a way to improve the skills of the public, because it would be good for them in the context of finding work. So again, it's a little bit murky. There's kind of some elements of user-centered design, some elements of the state knows what's good for you in the mix as well.
Absolutely, and you mentioned this sort of user testing and user-centered design. There's also a piece about sort of agile development and this iteration. I wonder if you could explain to our audience what that is, but also how it affected the development and the implementation of universal credit specifically.
Yeah, so agile development and associated user-centered design practices are now the norm within most parts of the UK government, and they basically boil down to, rather than trying to design a system up front, slicing it into smaller and smaller pieces and delivering things incrementally. So building something that meets either a smaller set of needs or serves a smaller number of people, and then gradually increasing that over time, doing user research as you go and using that research to improve the service that you're building. So in the context of universal credit, that means that after the reset and the new capability that DWP built up in-house, they went from a couple of big outsourced contracts to something that they had control over themselves. So they were writing the code, they were designing the software on a weekly basis. So a recent FOI request to DWP, they revealed that they currently release updates to the software every 2 weeks. That's kind of the norm, actually. If you're working in an agile development team, that's roughly what happens. You should be aiming to deploy changes to your service at least every kind of couple of weeks, ideally every day, sometimes more than once a day. And you'd find that being the norm in most government departments now in the UK who've got digital teams. You'd find it to be the norm in most modern digital startups, digital age companies as well. So it's not. Whereas historically, governments would kind of go out and almost try and buy a digital service like they would buy a bridge or a battleship, design it on paper up front and say, we'd like one of these, please. And then they may or may not get it. It's more about delivering value early and improving and iterating over time.
If Victoria may butt in for one sec, I had a quick follow-up question there. So to what extent does that switch from waterfall to agile development have an influence on how you develop a system that is user-friendly? In other words, what's the promise of user-friendliness related to that switch in design philosophy?
So you should have better feedback loops. So you should be able to get working software in front of real users sooner and be able to understand what works and what doesn't. And then if there are issues, you should be able to fix them more quickly. There's actually two more things to say on the concept of universal credit. Actually, one is to point out a really good report by the National Audit Office where they actually document the process through which universal credit development happens. And it includes things like they will do prototyping, they will do user research based on that prototyping. They will then deploy those changes. They will then write a report to check that it had the desired outcome. So it's all about kind of like reducing feedback loops. The other thing to say, sorry, the other thing just gone up my head. Sorry, it'll come back to me in a minute. But that's the main point to say is like it's pretty clear from the public documentation that DWP have built a really quite good agile development team, and they're able to deploy changes over time. Just come back to me. Sorry. The other thing is actually it allows you to then respond to unknowns. So we'll probably come onto this if we talk about COVID, but it allows, if you've got a fixed amount of development capability within your team, it allows you to redeploy that when events happen. And there are examples, again, publicly documented, where the Universal Credit team have decided to prioritize things like the development of a new system to make it easier to pay money directly to landlords rather than to claimants. Mm-hmm. You know, that would have entailed them deprioritizing some bits of work so that they can reprioritize that. So it gives you more flexibility and more a better ability to respond to unknowns.
Thank you.
So you mentioned COVID, and we'll go there now, as that's really relevant to sort of fleshing out this this promise and the kind of potential in theory of what's going on here. And obviously we'll then turn to how this has all been playing out in reality, which is a really important part of this conversation. But there is an argument to be made that this year, especially so since March, has really demonstrated this promise of digital welfare. In March, almost 1 million new claims for universal credit were made and successfully processed in the space of just a few weeks. So some are saying, where would we have been without this digital system? This is especially true when you compare it to the US context, in which some benefit claimants had to fax their applications. So I wonder, do you agree that this year has shown the promise of a digitalized system?
I think it's shown two things. It's shown the promise of a digitalized system and the value of having latent capability within the public service. So in terms of the first one, I think if the UK had to deal with COVID with a combination of tax credits and job seekers allowance, et cetera, probably would have been a lot messier. I think it's fair to say. So I think the department most definitely deserves some praise for having been able to serve those needs and serve those number of users.
Mm-hmm. Just to cut in there, actually, just to make it clear for our audience that the system is consolidating not only benefits but also tax credits. Do you want to kind of just quickly go into that, how that dynamic system kind of changes?
Yeah, so the welfare system and the welfare payments in the UK was split between various different organisations, between Department of Work and Pensions, but also tax credits, which are operated by HMRC, so the revenue and tax side of things. They all operated on different systems within different governmental silos. Those systems didn't talk to each other. If people suddenly were no longer qualified for one benefit, they would have to apply for another one from scratch or apply for tax credits from scratch. And there are lots of existing problems with those services. So it's not like the UK has gone from an idealized paper-based service to a digital system. There are already kind of legacy digital systems there. But I think if the UK had tried to cope with COVID with those, it would have been bumpier. It's not to say the department couldn't have done more potentially, but it wasn't very long ago when it was the expectation that when governments launched new digital services, they would fall over. They would crash, and that's broadly not happened. And I think that's partly because of what was there in terms of a digital welfare system, but also because of the latent capability within the public services there now. So it's not just the welfare system. Actually, if you look at some of the other UK government COVID responses, whether they're around housing, getting food packages to vulnerable people, getting money to employers for the furlough scheme. You know, those things were there because there is capability within the public service and associated, and there's sort of a more modern generation of suppliers to be able to quickly build products and services and change course quickly. And that comes back to that kind of agile question, or that agile capability.
Thanks, Richard. I think we deliberately started off discussing this promise of user-friendly digital welfare to point out to the promise of this. And I think there's wide agreement in the UK and elsewhere that in principle, a digital system has a lot of efficiencies and benefits from the user's perspective that can make for a much sort of better experience of claiming and maintaining benefits in principle. But as we've seen in the UK, and your report of April of this year also very much highlights that there have also been a lot of issues from the perspective of the user. And just to give a few examples, the NAO, for instance, in 2018 reported that half of all claimants were unable to make their claim online without help. More recent figures have shown that hundreds of thousands of people are abandoning their claim in the process, and so there is a bit of a gap between what this could be in principle and what it has been in reality. Just yesterday, for instance, Human Rights Watch released a report that addressed a lot of these problems from the user or citizen perspective. And so I wanted to discuss some of those challenges with you now, and I thought to divide that in three parts. So to start off with sort of talking about who is the user of the system and to what extent has the design taken into account that not everyone is average. Secondly, to discuss whether there's any improvements that could have been made on the digital side. So could technologists have done a better job? Were there lapses there? And then finally, I would like to discuss with you how political priorities other than making the system simpler to use may have also interfered with the implementation. But to start off with the user or the citizen, could you sort of highlight for us what the impact of universal credit as a digital first service in principle has been on the most vulnerable in the UK in light of existing digital divides there?
Yeah. I mean, I will caveat this by saying there are other people who've written, organisations who've written much more extensively about the impact on claimants than I have in this report, which I only very briefly touched on. So it's kind of point to the work of Citizens Advice and the Child Poverty Action Group in particular. It's actually very difficult to unpick which. So actually, let me just say a little bit about some of the issues first, and then where I was going to go then. So some of the issues that have included people having to wait a long time to get money. So initially, you didn't get any money for 6 weeks. It's now been reduced to 5. There are issues around people managing monthly payments because everything is based around a month, and some people don't earn money monthly. Some people earn it weekly, bi-weekly. There have been issues around claimants having to manage money that they weren't actually used to managing in the past. So historically, money would have been paid directly to social landlords. By default, that now goes to the claimant, who then has to redirect it to their landlord. There have been issues around people, like you say, maybe not completing the application process. It'd be difficult. But the thing that's really difficult is to actually unpick which elements of those problems are actually down to the technology, which elements are down to the complexity of the policy, and which elements are down to lack of digital skills. Like those are really, really difficult to unpick. So if you take the application process, for example, it may well be that people aren't completing it because it's just a lot of information to plug into the digital system. And this is one of these, I know we're going to get to trade-offs in a bit, but this is like one obvious trade-off. If you're going to have a system that demands a lot of data points to calculate a very specific benefit payment for somebody, if as a policymaker you want that level of control, you're placing additional administrative burden on the applicant because they've got essentially more forms to fill in. They've got to go and dig out more paperwork from the back of a drawer. They've got to go and talk to their landlord to get a signed copy of their rent agreement or whatever else they might need to collect together. So it's just an inherently complex thing. That then makes it a harder system to design. If you're a user experience designer and you're trying to design a sign-up form for a complex policy, it's going to be complex. There's only so much you can do to design away that complexity. So I think that's really the challenge for welfare rights campaigners, is actually to start to unpick those things, to start to demand better data from the department about what's really going on. Like why are those applications being abandoned, for example? Is it people who've got jobs, in which case great? Is it the fact that they've looked at it and realised that they're not going to get very much money, or they're not going to get any money for 6 weeks?
And just a sort of a logical follow-up there, what kind of information would that be then? So what kind of freedom of information request would make a difference? And do you think that kind of information would in principle be there, or is it just not collected? Because the reason I asked that question is that if you look at the earlier documents on universal credit from DWP, for instance, the 2012 digital strategy, there seems to be a lot of optimism about the average user. And to some extent, if I may sort of be opinionated, it seems almost sort of naive or not really interested in the reality. At some point they write, most of our customers and claimants are already online and more are moving online all the time. And that sort of approach seems to suggest that maybe setting aside sort of agile development and user-centered design, that I might not have taken that much research into who are our claimants, what is their digital situation. So actually it's two questions. One is, what kind of information would you need in a freedom of information request? And secondly, would it be realistic to assume that it's actually there? And if it's not there, then what could civil society do to fill those gaps?
So one of the things that I touched on in the report actually is that there's this kind of information asymmetry now that I can't remember whether it's the National Audit Office report or one of the GDS reports, but they point to the in-house data capability that the team have built up. So which is part of this kind of agile approach to design and development. So according to that report, they've got a really good data team who are able to understand exactly how the public are using the service so that they can respond to it. Now that information is not available to the public, and actually if you look at how the department publishes statistics about universal credit, they tend to be published on a kind of relatively ad hoc basis, monthly at best, but often ad hoc, certainly not the kind of real-time detailed data that we imagine that they've got to enable their own in-house decisions. So there's a kind of information asymmetry there that I think is worth recognizing. In terms of the question of were they being over-optimistic about users, I think probably yes, and in several ways. I think that's actually mixed in with this slightly paternalistic approach to the policy design as well, where, and I forget the exact quote, I thought I had it written down somewhere, but there were basically kind of quotes in the department in some early documents saying that it will kind of be good for people if we put it online because they'll learn how to use the internet, and that will make it easier for them to get work, and it becomes this kind of self-reinforcing thing that maybe is never really questioned properly. The other thing I would say is that universal credit's designed with one user in mind, i.e. the claimant, and actually the reality is that there are other entities, there are other organizations and people involved as well. And if you look to point to some of the child poverty action groups work, they have pointed out that the level of information that's given to a user to help them to understand how their claims have been calculated probably isn't good enough. And actually, they're regularly going to organisations to ask for help to understand that. So actually, like there is another user in the mix here, which is like those support organisations who are actually very underserved at the moment. And it appears anecdotally, there's lots of examples of users, claimants sharing their username and password so that third parties can help them understand what's been going on with their claims. The department has started to recognise some other types of users. They've designed services directly for landlords, for example. And they have apparently been looking at delegated access to accounts. But those things are going to have been absent for several years now. So yeah, I think it was kind of designed with a very much kind of like, it's a relationship between the state and the individual, or the state and the family, and actually it's more complex ecosystem than that.
It's interesting, right? Because that sort of concept of the user, there's a lot of sort of thoughts about the average beneficiary, but also a lot of thoughts about how the welfare state should function projected on that. And as you just said, that had to be readjusted over time. We started talking a bit about sort of the demand side, the person or the organizations helping to claim benefits. There's the other side, and you just hinted at that. How is the system designed by the technologists working within DWP and GDS? And I hope you don't mind, but I want to put you on the spot a little bit and talk briefly about how the design could have been better. For instance, if you take HRW's report of yesterday, but there are many others like CPAC who have written about this. There's several, if you will, flaws in the system. For instance, how to identify yourself in the online process when you claim benefits. There have been a lot of issues with Verify. There have been issues with the RTI system, with quite significant error rates happening there. There have been comments by CPAC and others about sort of how intuitive and how sort of user-friendly the interface is, the online journal. So from your perspective, having worked on these issues, do you think things could have been done differently? And what kind of factors played into some of the shortcomings? Was it inevitable to some extent? Were you sort of limited by resources and by the state of technology? Or wasn't that really what was to blame there?
I mean, I think to say two things up front before I try and answer that. I think one, it's difficult to unpick the things that are policy and the things that are design choices. Also, we kind of don't know the answer to some of these things because it's hard to actually understand how the system works and what trade-offs have been made. So because there's limited documentation about how the system works in public, because the source code is not open, because it's not possible for researchers to understand how the system works, and organizations like Make Confidential have to kind of go and reverse engineer the system from freedom of information requests. It's hard to really understand to what extent it's actually, which bits have been automated and which bits are kind of Wizard of Oz style, there's a manual process going on. We don't know the answer to those things. Those two caveats aside, there are definitely a few things you can point to which are in the domain of technology and design. So one is the RTI system you mentioned. So just to quickly say, RTI stands for real-time information. It's a system that's operated by HMRC, the tax office, and it is designed to collect information about earnings so they understand how much to tax people. So the UK has unlike the US, most people in the UK don't do a tax return, just like it's automatically calculated, and RTI was designed for that purpose. DWP kind of repurposed that data. They've created their own copy of it for the purposes of running universal credit, and stuff falls between the gaps is a major problem there. So whether that's technologists' fault or not, I think you can argue both ways. It is a technology problem. It's probably more a question of institutional organization than anything else. But definitely people fall through the gaps there. Two other kind of things to quickly say. I said two, but I'm going to do three. The second one is around the statement, and again, like CPAG had done have made some suggestions about how the design of that could be changed, and also the journal as well. Like these things are relatively bare bones. I think there's a lot of scope for kind of like rethinking the design of those and revisiting them. And I think the onus in part there is on welfare reform organisations to actually start caring about design, and you know, which CPEG have done actually, which is really good. Like they've actually they've written reports with proposed design changes in them, and I think it'd be really good to see more organisations critiquing welfare systems like that. The final thing to say is that it's also interesting to look at the things that they haven't designed and they haven't automated. So the appeal system, for example, if you want to appeal a decision that's not really automated, there's an email address and a postal address. If when you're applying for universal credit in the first place, there are some things that actually you become entitled to around transport passes, and other benefits. No, those are not signposted in the sign-up process. And actually, from the point of view of the department, why would they? Why would they invest that kind of time and effort to do it? But from the point of view of the user, it's most definitely a benefit. So I think there are some examples of things that technology designs could have been better. But until we really understand exactly how the system's working, it's very hard to unpick. It really is. And a lot of them are just down to the underlying complexity of the policy.
Absolutely, because this brings us to sort of that third factor we've talked about, sort of the user that's seen as sort of average from the perspective of the designers, the possible flaws in the design, but there's definitely a third dimension here, and that is that there's underlying policy choices that have influenced what universal credit as a digital service looks like. You've just pointed out, for instance, the fact that there's no opportunity to appeal, which does seem to be a political choice, which was then translated into the design. In other words, I don't think it is likely that that was just an oversight, right? There was a decision taken at some point, likely to not include that. But there are other sort of more issues more central to universal credit. You've written in your report about how universal credit is in fact a hyper means tested benefit, and in a way how the digital is supportive of that policy goal, and that a lot of sort of problems originate from the fact that the government wants to hyper means test. Could you explain to us what you mean by that? And that's, I think, also sort of a good point of discussion where you can talk a little bit about this tension between politics and technology, because it seems like the politicians can often hide behind the technologists, just as the technologists might sometimes hide behind the politicians, and sort of take us to what hyper means tested benefits mean, and also how that relates to that tension between politics and design.
Yeah, I'd actually tackle two things there. There's the hyper means tested element of it, and also the kind of the just the general opinionated nature of universal credit in policy terms. So, what do I mean by hyper means tested? I broadly mean if you look at the benefit system post-war in the UK, it was more at the universal end of the spectrum, despite the name of universal credit. It was not like they were generally the number of data points required to understand whether you should be paid something and how much you would be paid was smaller. You know, not kind of universal basic income simplicity, but they were definitely down that end of the spectrum. Universal credit requires a lot of data to be able to calculate the correct amount and correct conditionality regime for an individual or for a family. So that's kind of what I mean by hyper means tested. There's a lot of variables there, and they're there because policymakers want to be able to direct public money to reward or punish certain behaviours, essentially. And you know, in the context of universal credit, that is things like trying to reward two-parent families, trying to encourage people to manage their money on a monthly basis, trying to encourage people to take more work. You know, there are, you know, these things are kind of baked into the underlying policy, and the digital side of things is trying to kind of work around that. I think the challenge for welfare reform people is to get to how can you put the technology to one side enough that you can evaluate whether the underlying policy intent is correct or not. Because that's, I think, the thing that's been missing from universal credit. If you look at a lot of the changes that have happened over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, they've really been kind of sticking plasters on the underlying policy concepts. So rather than addressing the fact that lots of people do not manage their earnings on a monthly basis, and lots of jobs do not pay on a monthly basis, rather than kind of address that and give the power to the user to choose when they want their universal credit to be calculated and when they want to be paid, they've kind of stuck to this premise of it must be monthly. Everything else must bend to that. To the point where even I think at one point the government was lobbying supermarkets who pay people on a forward weekly basis to change how they pay things. So it's like it's not the policy that's wrong. It's the real world, and there's kind of lots of that going on. So I think there needs to be, now universal credit is 10 years old. There needs to be some real kind of challenging around those underlying principles, and like, had they worked or not? If the intent of universal credit was to get more people earning more money over their working life, is it doing it? If the intent, wrongly or rightly, to reward two-parent families, like, has that worked or not? Or were those essentially policy guesses 10 years ago that just haven't paid off? And so if you look at, I think most of the big, the digital inclusion stuff aside, if you look at a lot of the things that have been driving really negative outcomes around poverty, they are the 5 or 6 week wait, they're the monthly payment, they're the fact that over 50% of people who apply for the benefit end up in debt immediately to the government because they take an advance out. These are like systemic policy questions rather than anything to do with technology.
Just one more question on this, Richard. You've mentioned this a couple of times that some groups like CPAC and others are doing excellent work sort of addressing some of the design issues with universal credit. And that has been quite a leap for a lot of welfare rights and human rights organizations to sort of get into the weeds of how that works and what is possible in terms of recommendations. And that work, I think, should be commended, and it's great that they're going in that direction. But obviously, the third sector is limited in terms of its resources. Perhaps it's an unfair question, but to what extent do technologists have a moral obligation to push back against certain policy preferences? I realize that you cannot stop a policy reform like this by just saying I'm not going to work on it, but I'm sure that at the edges of the reform there have been moments where technologists internally could have pushed back and said it's inevitable that RTI will come up with a 2% error rate, and I'm putting that in a memo to the minister just to notify her or him that that's an inevitable consequence of this choice. At what point in time do you go public, for instance, and or do you write an op-ed in a newspaper? So perhaps my question is, what are the ethics or morals here for people who work in government on technology design, like on universal credit? Do you see a role for them, or is it unfair to put that much burden on technologists?
I mean, I think that the design culture that's emerged within government over the last few years is very much around trying to make things better for the public. That's why people go and work there for the most part. I mean, I'm sure a lot of those things will have been flagged to ministers. I can't speak to those specific examples, but I'm sure they will have done. I mean, I can say a bit more about where it would be good to get to, I think, is actually it would be good if more digital teams in DWP and elsewhere were able to be more open about their work. If they were able, and some of that's about transparency, which I think we're going to come on to in a minute, but actually just being able to kind of throw open doors and explain how those decisions have been made, and explain their work. And to be able to signpost the things which are explicitly political decisions. Again, it's about kind of teasing out the things that are about technology and the things that are about politics. But yeah, I think part of the answer is like, the question to ask ourselves is like, what does good policy development look like in the digital age? And it is about being more open. It's about admitting mistakes. It's about sharing potential changes sooner, which I think I've seen the design team, I've sort of seen public events being published, or kind of semi-public events because sort of people who are interested in welfare reform, that I think the UC design team have been having in the open. So maybe that stuff's beginning to happen a little bit. Yeah, there's definitely scope for more openness.
Thanks so much, and we'll get to transparency in a minute. And obviously, I fully realize that, you know, if a minister is asked to come to Parliament, there might be a big interest on the part of the politicians to not bring along their technologists who can then speak openly about some of the possibilities. So I realize, you know, that there's limits to what technologists can do. Which brings us to our next topic, the future, and Victoria will take us there.
Yeah, and just as a quick reminder, we're going to get to the Q&A very soon, but please keep sending in your questions. Yeah, to kind of build on what you were saying about what needs to happen in the future, I just wanted to ask about government as a platform, as an approach. This is something that you've been a proponent of, and I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. So this is a phrase that was coined by a technologist called Tim O'Reilly 10 years ago, I think now. And broadly, it is about rethinking the way government organises its work. So it's based around shared reusable components, definitive data sources, broadly so it becomes quicker and easier to assemble public services from component parts, but also to make some of that data and information available outside government potentially to third sector organisations where appropriate to the private sector. But it's really kind of trying to move away from what we have at the moment, which is a very siloed approach to government, where DWP will be responsible for everything from the user experience down to the underlying data. And actually, if you're another part of government and you want to access that, it's very difficult. And actually, some of the problems we see with RTI and payments being wrong is really it's down to that structure of government problem question. Mm-hmm. It's two systems run by two different organisations with different institutional priorities who just don't quite work together properly. So government's platform is really about rethinking the way government organises its approach to technology.
So some of our audience, especially human rights practitioners, might have alarm bells ringing a little bit with the idea of breaking down silos and essentially kind of much more information sharing, not only between government departments, but also with third parties like the private sector. You critique universal credit for being hyper means tested, but that may open up even more information sharing where you have, for example, a supermarket kind of sharing purchasing information, for example, with DWP, and that leads to sanctions. So that there's definitely something slightly scary about it, perhaps. And I wonder how you would respond to any of those kind of critiques.
I mean, I think we shouldn't fool ourselves that the way government shares data at the moment is any kind of ideal. Actually, the way RTI is one example, but there are many, many others across government that information data about people tends to get shared between different corners of government in a way that's not very transparent, is not accountable, is hard for the public to understand. There was the kind of typical example is almost the archetypal example is the NHS and the Home Office sharing data for purposes of immigration purposes, and you know, and that happened because some people in one department signed a memorandum of understanding to another department, and Parliament didn't know about it, the public didn't know about it. It was only when Public Health England kind of spotted it and kicked up a stink that it became kind of a public, something was done about it. So we shouldn't kind of kid ourselves that what we have at the moment is good. Part of the government as a platform approach is about critically thinking about what are the information assets that government has and what governance processes should sit around them, what transparency processes should sit around them. How do you bring the public into that world so they can understand how data about them is being used to deliver public services? There is a potential in some instances to take some information that government owns and reuse it in the private sector, and there's some instances where it's going to be appropriate to get information from the private sector into government. So one example of the latter is the Making Tax Digital initiative from HMRC, where they take VAT information, sales tax information directly from accounting software these days, rather than getting people to fill in forms. Yeah, that's probably an appropriate use of that kind of approach. There will be lots and lots of other ones where it's not appropriate. So like the supermarket example is obviously a kind of classic one. I think we're already entering a world where there is more data about people in circulation. The question is like, what are the governance processes you put in place? And how do you have a good political conversation about what is appropriate and what's not. Because I think if we kind of view it as if we're not able to have an honest, robust technical conversation about what are the affordances of these technologies and when's it appropriate to use them, then it could happen by accident without anyone noticing, or we could actually end up with something that is just like messy and unaccountable, like we have at the moment, frankly. Sorry, it's a slightly garbled answer at the end, but
not at all.
I think, and just so that's kind of one thing, is like what we've got at the moment is not great. We are going to move to something else, but we need to make damn sure that the governance processes are in place and do a good job of it. The other thing to say is that if we're going to have means-tested benefits, that's an if we're going to have them, and if we're going to have elements of the welfare system where we expect the public to prove to government that they are applying for jobs or going on training courses, right? If we're going to have that kind of world, is it reasonable to expect the public to copy and paste that information, to type it in, to send reports into government when actually they could do it in an automated way? And again, there will be times when it's appropriate and times when it's not. But at the moment, if you're on universal credit and you want to claim additional money for childcare, there's a form you have to go and fill in every month. Like, if we were really harnessing technology to save the public time, to reduce administrative burden, we would have automated that. That's the sort of thing I think there are opportunities here to actually kind of save the public time. The way government approaches automation at the moment, though, it doesn't really think about the public's time. It tends to think about its own time and money.
That's a nice bridge towards the Q&A, I think. I want to get to transparency, but there was an excellent question by Karen Jung that touches upon that. So I just wanted to read you that question, and then we'll get to a question by Joe Tomlinson. So Karen, I have it here. So Karen writes, really fascinating insight, thank you. I'm struck by your observation about the difficulty in unpacking what was a problem with tech design, what was policy, and understanding how exactly the system works, including particular trade-offs that were made. So she has two questions in relation to that. First, is there a clear system for managing the accountability of these policy and technology decisions so that one can trace the underlying decisions, who made them, whether they were justified and for what reasons? And if there's not such a system, why not? And should there be? And then relatedly, to what extent is this obscuring of lines of accountability attributable to an agile development, ad hoc, build it, test it, and change it mentality? So do you see this as a problem? Why or why not? That's an excellent question.
Yeah, so the first question, is there a process? It appears so. So the NAO report I mentioned earlier, that's got a lovely kind of flow diagram in it where it kind of shows the steps that a policy change goes through, from someone describing the policy intent to it being shipped as working code and a follow-up process. So that process exists. As far as I have come across, though, that it's documented in that report, but the artifacts that get created during that process are not published anywhere, and it would be great if they were. The second question, like, is it a result of agile development? I think it is a characteristic of digital public services, is a better way to think about it. Agile is a way of creating digital services. It's quite a good one because it allows you to respond to changes in user behavior, security issues, political changes. You know, you need to be able to do those things. But I think it's of the nature of digital services, modern digital services, that they change over time. So the service that exists this week will be different to some extent to one that exists in a couple of weeks' time. If you add into that as well personalization, so universal credit is a personalized benefit, so the things that you see on screen will be different than the things I see on screen. So we're leaving a world where we risk losing the ability to have a shared public understanding about how our public services work if we're not careful. So at the moment, we can walk into a hospital or a job centre, a journalist can walk in there, or member of the public, and they will have a shared experience. They will see and experience the same things. That's not the same with digital public services, where they will change over time, and the more they are personalised, the shared experience could disappear as well. Which is where the kind of transparency, a very quite detailed approach to transparency is needed to try and rectify that.
To make that very concrete, how could you respond to that? So the fact that everyone has sort of a different interface and that the system changes every 2 weeks. What's a very concrete method, maybe from Universal Credit or from another system that you know of, to deal with that sort of constant iteration change? How to capture those changes over time and make sure that there's still that sort of common knowledge base as you would have as a journalist if you walk into a job center, or as a journalist if you read a piece of policy or a law?
Yeah, it's really about making the entire technology stack transparent. That doesn't necessarily mean opening up all the code for everything, but it means things like it's providing the hooks for journalists, for organisations like Med Confidential who want to understand data flows, for the National Audit Office or for parliamentary committees who want to understand how these services work. They need to understand how the changes right through the technology stack. So that means things like publishing the data models that are used, literally just like what data is stored and does that change over time. So there's an example, Estonia do this, like there is a place where all the data models for all public data registries are published in the open online. I don't know if they do it for individual services, but they do it for their kind of definitive like population registers and the like. Source code being open is actually a requirement of the government's digital service standard that all source code is open. It very rarely happens. Yeah, it definitely hasn't happened with Universal Credit. Although gov.uk, the main website, that's open. Some other examples are open, but Universal Credit is not open.
That's because the standard is not binding. It's a guideline.
The power of the government digital service to enforce it has waned over time as departments have built their own capabilities. Right. The short answer. There's a much longer version of that, but ultimately you need an organisation at the centre who can actually enforce it, and it doesn't really exist at the moment. Mm-hmm. You could make it a law. I think some countries have made it law that source code should be open. But code's another part of it. So there's a data side of it, there's the code, and then there's also the user interface. So with a personalised system, you can never necessarily like publish everything that everyone sees, but you can publish examples.
Right.
So, and there's 2 places this has happened recently. So the NHS, UK, England and Wales NHS track and trace app, the team that, because there was a lot of controversy around what information that would be collecting, how it would be working, they've published example screenshots of that service online on the government website. There is also an example from the Department for Education in the UK government where the design teams there have regularly been publishing the designs that they're testing. So this is before things even get to the public, the things that they're using to explore ideas and to users' artifacts and user research. They've actually been publishing an archive of those online. Okay. So there's kind of components of it. And then finally, there's also the data, so like how are people using this and getting realistic, real-time statistics rather than this kind of world of Excel files being dumped on the internet every couple of months with different field names.
I also just recommend our audience to read Richard's report, which we'll make available later on the webpage, which does go into quite a lot of detail on transparency. There are 2 more questions. I might just ask both of them at the same time, and then you can answer both of them, and then we have to wrap up because we promised to keep it at about an hour. We're doing quite well so far. So one question is by Joe Tomlinson, who asks, I wondered if Richard thinks that the use of agile methods transfers controversial policy decisions about whether to use technology into serve delivery design questions, and therefore marginalizes a more active and wider policy discussion about the transition to a digital welfare state. And then Peter Wells asks, how do you think UC has affected the relationship between frontline staff in DWP centers or staff in local authorities? So those are 2 more questions, and Shelley Bielfeld has asked a question too, but I'll ask that in a minute.
Okay, I would do my best on both of those, but I'm slightly limited in terms of my experience. So, does it marginalise wider policy questions. I think part of the problem historically is that government has treated policy and the delivery of services as separate things. There is immense power that is held by the design and delivery teams. Right? There's no getting away from that. The choices that designers make are increasingly powerful. And as we digitize more important, more high stakes public services, like they only get more powerful. Their decisions are really, really important, which is why the transparency angle is so important. But we also need to think about how to bring policy and delivery teams into one, rather than they're kind of being this separate, seen as a kind of like separate thing. Like policy is increasingly, policy and delivery are the same thing. So we need to make sure that there are policy people on design teams, and also that policy people outside government are engaging directly with those teams and able to engage directly with those teams.
Excellent, thanks. And final question here.
So quickly try and answer Peter's question.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
The short answer is I don't know, but there's certainly two things of concern in that world, which is that even though I think the government's announced that they're going to increase the number of work coaches, which are the people who provide direct support through the digital app and face-to-face to claimants. But I think the plan is to still reduce the number of job centres. You're also seeing the number of, seeing job centres move into libraries and other public spaces. And I think that really raises questions around surveillance and people's ability, you know, what does it feel like going into a library with your children if you've got the job centre in the corner over there? And it's just, we really need to think more about what are the offline capabilities that are needed to support the service. And I think the government it would be a huge mistake to lose more of the job centre network, because actually that should be a place to be able to serve the needs that you can never serve over a digital channel. I imagine people who work in those places are a little bit, I don't know. I would only be guessing what they were thinking.
Final question is along similar lines, also about sort of the offline situation. So it's by Shelley Bielefeld, who's joining us from Australia, I think. Richard, you mentioned the need to tease out what are technology issues and what are political issues, re universal credit, but aren't the two interconnected? The decision to force people to use the internet to access their benefit payments seems to be both. Did the UK government give people extra money to cover the extra technology costs associated with needing internet access? Computers with internet plans, mobile phones with data plans, or were claimants expected to cover the extra technology costs?
They're expected to cover the costs, and that was actually one of the things I put as an aside in the report. Is actually it'd be really good to know if the department has estimated what those costs are. So I didn't do a lot of primary interviews for this report. It was mostly published documents, but I did interview a couple of people who are kind of current claimants just to understand different some specifics of the service. And one of them actually said to me is like, there's a real problem that if you get, at the moment you get a text message telling you that you've got an update to your account, but it doesn't tell you what the update is. So you then have to get the bus across town, go use it, pay £1 for £1 for to use an internet cafe for an hour, then travel back home again. So there's kind of this kind of overhead that I think is not quantified at the moment. And it would be really good to know across the board, what is that cost?
Absolutely.
And then you can start to think about what are the interventions that you can put in place to mitigate that. And yeah, maybe the answer is give people phones. Maybe it is more access to free Wi-Fi. Whatever, there's a bunch of policy interventions that you could think of, but we need to weigh the problem first. And I don't think anyone's done that.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And that's one of the things that keeps on sort of fascinating me, how little we actually know about that particular aspect of the impact of universal credit. Even though the system is, as you said, by now a decade old, we still know very little about the impact on certain groups. We have to wrap up. We're at about an hour. I just wanted to thank you, Richard, for what I found was a very fascinating discussion. I definitely learned a lot here, and I think for our audience members, you probably gave a perspective that they're often not sort of familiar with, that is someone who has intimate knowledge of sort of how design works in practice in government. So thanks a million for your time. This conversation, as I said at the start, has been recorded and will be made available on our center's website, CHRGJ.org, in a few days, accompanied by a brief blog where we summarize the discussion, and we'll also make other resources available for those who are interested. And I just wanted to say to our audience members, please join us for the next iteration of this conversation series on October 28th, when we will be joined by author Nanjala Nyabola from Kenya. And with her, we'll talk about Huduma Namba, Kenya's digital ID system. Thank you very much for your time and for your participation. Thanks.
Thank you.